In the aftermath of World War II, Moss Side, once a bustling district tied to Manchester's industrial strength, began a slow decline. As factories closed and the textile industry waned, employment opportunities evaporated. Between 1951 and 1981, Manchester lost over 150,000 manufacturing jobs, and inner-city neighbourhoods like Moss Side bore the brunt of this economic contraction. Moss Side, like many urban areas, experienced a transition from production to deindustrialization without a clear recovery strategy. The 1960s and 70s saw the arrival of thousands of Caribbean and South Asian immigrants, many of whom settled in Moss Side due to affordable housing and the presence of existing migrant communities. However, these populations were quickly marginalized in a rapidly deteriorating environment. By 1977, unemployment among black youth in Manchester was estimated to be 3 times higher than among white youth. A 1981 Commission for Racial Equality study found that only 20% of ethnic minority residents in inner Manchester had access to stable full-time employment. Compounding the issue was the urban policy of containment. Rather than integrating Moss Side into wider development plans, city planners pursued a strategy that effectively isolated it. Disinvestment became formalized as renewal initiatives focused on more affluent or gentrifiable districts. As a result, public services dwindled, libraries closed, schools lost funding, and healthcare access shrank. In 1979, Moss Side had only 2 fully functioning GP practices, serving over 15,000 residents. Housing deteriorated, and many Victorian homes were left to decay or became overcrowded bedsits. By the late 1970s, over 30% of Moss Side's housing stock was considered substandard. A Manchester City Council housing survey from 1980 identified more than 5,000 homes in Moss Side that lacked basic amenities such as central heating or indoor plumbing. Infrastructure aged without renewal. Broken roads, unreliable transit links, and aging utilities compounded the sense of neglect. Youth services and recreational facilities were systematically defunded. The decline created a vacuum, one that would be filled not by regeneration, but by a shadow economy. Informal markets, including the burgeoning drug trade, filled the void left by absent state support and collapsing formal employment sectors. By the early 1980s, Moss Side was fertile ground for illicit enterprise. Cannabis had already made its mark via Caribbean migration patterns, but it was the introduction of heroin and later crack cocaine that transformed the community. These drugs didn't appear randomly. They arrived through international smuggling routes. Opium from the Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, and Golden Triangle, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, trafficked via Europe and Africa, found its way into Britain's ports, eventually trickling into cities like Manchester. The heroin crisis in the UK began intensifying around 1979, and by 1985, the number of known heroin users nationwide had doubled. Manchester's inner-city areas, including Moss Side, saw a steep increase in drug-related arrests and hospital admissions due to overdoses. According to a 1988 Home Office report, Greater Manchester Police had identified Moss Side as one of the city's top 3 drug hotspots. By 1991, the number of people seeking treatment for heroin addiction in Manchester had increased by 150% over 5 years. In Moss Side, disenfranchised youth, locked out of jobs and alienated from school, found a foothold in drug distribution networks, with youth unemployment reaching over 40% in parts of Manchester during the early 1980s. Many turned to dealing as a last resort. Street-level drug economies were structured around peer influence and necessity, rather than traditional criminal masterminds. Older gang members often acted as intermediaries between local communities and larger crime syndicates importing drugs into the UK. The impact was visible in local infrastructure. Abandoned buildings and derelict properties were frequently used as distribution hubs or shooting galleries. Drug paraphernalia littered alleyways and playgrounds, creating unsafe environments and pushing families further into isolation. By the late 1980s, drug markets had become normalized in parts of Moss Side. Entire blocks were known for dealing activities, with certain streets referred to as no-go zones by police and residents alike. A 1989 Manchester Council survey noted that residents in some blocks rated drug crime and related violence as their top public safety concern. Local business owners reported losing up to 40% in revenue due to reduced foot traffic and customer fears of violence. This normalization didn't just reflect a criminal issue, but a socio-economic one. When opportunity vanished, underground economies flourished. In Moss Side, the drug trade became an unfortunate substitute for formal employment, reinforcing cycles of poverty, addiction, and exclusion. What began as informal networks of young dealers grew into more structured operations. Gangs in Moss Side evolved beyond petty crime, establishing turf and hierarchies to manage drug distribution more efficiently. These groups often trace their roots to local crews and familial connections, but as money from drugs increased, the stakes and violence intensified. Notorious local entities, sometimes stylized by media as gangs, controlled territories within Moss Side, regulating who could sell drugs and where. The Gooch and Doddington gangs, among the most recognized, became synonymous with territorial battles in the 1990s and early 2000s. These turf wars led to a series of violent incidents, including drive-by shootings, stabbings, and retaliatory attacks. Greater Manchester Police reported a near doubling of firearm discharges between 1996 and 1999 in Moss Side and surrounding areas. The use of firearms, once rare in British cities, became more frequent in Moss Side, prompting national media attention and police intervention. A 2003 Home Office study identified Moss Side as one of the top UK neighbourhoods affected by gun crime at the time. This notoriety led to the area being labelled the gun capital of the UK, an image that further stigmatised the community and often overshadowed the voices of residents working for peace and reform. Gang structures became more organised, mimicking corporate hierarchies, with recruiters, enforcers, and distributors. Some began laundering money through legitimate businesses or extorting local shops, embedding themselves deeper into the economic fabric of the area. According to a 2007 report by the Centre for Social Justice, organised criminal networks in Moss Side were estimated to bring in several million pounds annually through the drug trade. The appeal of gang membership for some youth was rooted in economic desperation and social exclusion. For many, gang affiliation offered status, income, and a sense of belonging that traditional institutions failed to provide. Young people excluded from schools or living in single-parent households were particularly vulnerable. A 2004 study by the Youth Justice Board found that youth in gang-affected areas like Moss Side were twice as likely to experience unemployment and 3 times more likely to encounter the criminal justice system. These dynamics were not unique to Moss Side, but the concentration of poverty, racial marginalization, and lack of oversight made the neighborhood especially susceptible to the entrenchment of organized crime. The state response to rising drug use and crime in Moss Side was rooted in aggressive law enforcement. Police operations like stop and search, targeted raids, and undercover surveillance were deployed extensively during the 1980s and 90s. However, these strategies disproportionately affected black youth, reinforcing long-standing tensions between the community and law enforcement. Stop and search incidents skyrocketed during this period. A 1999 report by the Institute of Race Relations revealed that black individuals in Greater Manchester were 7 times more likely to be stopped by police than white individuals. In 1993 alone, Nearly 60% of all stop-and-search cases in Manchester targeted ethnic minorities, despite these groups comprising only a fraction of the total population. The lack of transparency and accountability in these procedures further fueled community resentment. Mass arrests were common, yet they often netted low-level dealers rather than dismantling the networks at the top. Between 1987 and 1995, Greater Manchester Police conducted over 12,000 drug-related arrests citywide, with Moss Side accounting for a disproportionate share. Yet, the conviction rate for significant traffickers remained relatively low, indicating an ineffective top-down enforcement strategy. According to internal reviews, less than 15% of arrests in Moss Side during this period led to long-term sentences for major criminal organizers. Trust in the police eroded further as many residents felt criminalized rather than protected. Critics argued that the police treated Moss Side as a war zone rather than a community in crisis. Community policing models were largely absent, replaced instead by paramilitary-style tactics that created fear rather than cooperation. During the height of the crack epidemic, Moss Side was subject to one of the most intensive surveillance operations in Manchester's history. CCTV coverage expanded rapidly, and specialized drug task forces were deployed. Despite this, drug markets persisted, the police lacking community cooperation and constrained by limited understanding of the social dynamics at play, were often reactive rather than proactive. Several undercover operations in the early 2000s were later criticized for disproportionately targeting black youths without adequate evidence. Efforts to introduce community liaison officers and youth outreach programs in the late 1990s saw some improvement in relations, but the damage from earlier decades left a deep mistrust. A 2002 Home Office study found that less than 20% of residents in Moss Side expressed confidence in the fairness of police conduct, one of the lowest rates in the region. Furthermore, a 2005 local crime audit showed that 62% of residents believed that policing in the area was focused more on control than community safety. The flood of drugs into Moss Side had devastating consequences. Heroin addiction took root among the most vulnerable populations, often those already facing housing insecurity and unemployment. By the early 1990s, local clinics reported sharp increases in needle-related health issues and overdoses. According to the Department of Health, heroin-related hospital admissions across Manchester rose by over 60% between 1988 and 1993. Crack cocaine, with its highly addictive nature and rapid turnover, brought new dimensions to local crime. Petty thefts, car break-ins, and home invasions rose as addiction spread. In 1995, the Manchester Police reported a 40% increase in theft and burglary in areas with known drug hotspots. The community's fabric was torn further as families disintegrated under the weight of addiction, incarceration, and poverty. The social consequences were compounded by inadequate treatment facilities. In the early 90s, Moss Side had just one publicly funded rehab program, with long waiting lists and under-resourced staff. Many residents who sought help were redirected to facilities outside the community, creating access barriers and reducing success rates. Children growing up in this environment faced compounded trauma, exposure to drug abuse, the loss of parents to prison or addiction, and constant exposure to violence. A 2001 study by the National Children's Bureau found that children in drug-affected households were significantly more likely to experience school exclusion, mental health issues, and low academic attainment. Schools, already underfunded, struggled to support students dealing with complex home situations. Truancy rates soared, and many teachers reported being unprepared to address behavioral challenges tied to trauma. This generational impact created a cycle where young people became increasingly vulnerable to the same systems, addiction, gangs, incarceration, that had destabilized their families. During the height of Moss Side's drug crisis, media outlets often focused on gang violence and drug busts, rarely contextualizing these within systemic neglect. Sensationalist headlines painted the area as a lawless urban jungle, reinforcing stereotypes and further isolating the community. National tabloid newspapers frequently referred to Moss Side as Britain's Bronx, a moniker that misrepresented local dynamics and entrenched fear-based narratives. Research by the University of Manchester in 2005 found that 68% of national media stories about Moss Side from 1990 to 2004 were crime-related, while fewer than 5% highlighted positive developments or community efforts. This skewed portrayal contributed to stigmatization that affected housing investment, school enrollment, and the local business confidence. Government responses were sporadic. While some funding was directed toward urban regeneration, such as the City Challenge program in the early 1990s, these efforts were piecemeal and lacked continuity. Evaluations found that many initiatives were undermined by shifting political priorities and short-term grant cycles. Long-term strategies for addiction treatment, community development, or economic revitalization were largely absent. For example, between 1991 and 2001, Moss Side received less than 3% of the Greater Manchester region's total drug treatment funding, despite accounting for over 20% of its reported heroin-related incidents. Public policies often fail to address the root causes of the crisis: inequality, exclusion, and disinvestment, focusing instead on punitive measures and performance metrics. Government white papers from the period emphasized crime control over socio-economic reform. Programs designed to rehabilitate drug users often lacked cultural competency and were not informed by local voices, making them ineffective or poorly received. The gap between media sensationalism and policy substance meant that Moss Side's underlying issues remained unresolved long after the cameras left. Despite these challenges, Moss Side did not fold. Grassroots organizations, churches, and health advocates fought back. Programs emerged to offer rehabilitation, youth mentorship, and legal advocacy. Community leaders called for harm reduction approaches and reinvestment, not just tougher policing. The African and Caribbean Mental Health Services, founded in the 1990s, became a vital institution addressing culturally specific mental health needs often ignored by mainstream services. By the 2000s, efforts began to shift toward prevention and education. Youth clubs such as Hideaway Youth Project became safe havens for teenagers, offering mentoring, job training, and conflict resolution. The Moss Side Millennium Powerhouse opened in 2000 as a community hub that brought together education, sports, arts, and social services under one roof. Former gang members became mentors, helping to dissuade younger generations from following the same paths. The community embraced initiatives like the Peace Week campaign, which engaged schools, families, and local businesses in anti-violence workshops and performances. These interventions were supported by partnerships between community leaders and Greater Manchester Police, fostering a new era of dialogue. Local residents pushed for better housing, schooling, and public health infrastructure. As a result, Moss Side saw an increase in funding for community housing refurbishments through the New Deal for Communities program. Between 2002 and 2012, youth crime in Moss Side fell by over 35%, demonstrating the effectiveness of community-led interventions over purely punitive approaches. Moss Side's recovery has been uneven but persistent. Today, it stands as a symbol of both the scars of institutional failure and the resilience of community activism. It is no longer solely defined by its challenges, but increasingly by the strength, creativity, and determination of its people. Drugs did not arrive in Moss Side by chance. They followed routes laid by economic neglect, social exclusion, and institutional blindness. This crisis was never just about crime, but about what happens when a community is left behind. As Moss Side continues to rebuild, Its story serves as a cautionary tale and a call to action. Where there is neglect, shadow economies rise, and where there is community strength, even the deepest wounds can begin to heal.